Hello, everyone, and welcome to 180 Degrees of Impact. My name is Matt Scott, and today I have the honor of being joined by Robert Egger. Hey, how's it going?
Good, man. Nice to be with you, Matt.
Yeah, it's good to be with you. And how are you doing today? How are things?
Good, man. I mean, it's funny, man. I've been in this business a long time, and I've always been intrigued by people, particularly really poor people who I've served most of my career. Oftentimes, when you say, "How you doing today?" it's like I woke up, and there is an element of gratefulness that, I'm alive. I got an adventure ahead of me. I've done good work in the past, and I'm hanging with you right now, man. So life is good.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you talk about that because I was reading a book by Sheryl Option B by Sheryl Sandberg like a while ago, and she mentions the distinction between the question "How are you?" and like "How are you doing today?" because there are big differences. Like in general, it's like I'm glad that I got up, but maybe today is a better day and everything. And you have a lot of bright days ahead of you and also behind you, and so. Uh,
Yeah, it's an interesting crossroads where you and I meet, man, because I literally am. I'm 60 years old, man, and I'm ending one phase of I shouldn't say ending, but I'm transitioning from a phase in which I ran nonprofits and they were my organizations. I built them and grew them to one now where I'm going to attempt, and we'll see where this leads, but to be of a more general service to how do you in effect really chase results and change within your own life, but also, in the field or in our country. The thing I don't want to do is be a consultant. I've been open source my entire life,
yeah.
and I want to avoid at all costs having to charge anybody for the knowledge I've gained. So we'll see where it ends, man. But today, you and me, man, we're hanging, and I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, and I love that attitude, and I mean you clearly are sharing what's on your mind. I'm excited to dive more into that, but first, I'm sure there are people who are despite your career and all that you've accomplished, there are people who are wondering who you are and what you're up to. So, could you please introduce yourself? I'm actually really interested to hear how you introduce yourself nowadays to folks.
Well, my name is Robert Egger. I'm a bad motherfucker.
That's it.
Well, if people want to know more, but yeah, man. So in other
Yeah.
words, I'm the founder of the DC Central Kitchen, Campus Kitchens, the Nonprofit Congress, the LA Kitchen. Written books or written a book. I've had a very purposeful life,
Hmm.
but at the same time, I'm a white dude in America
Yeah.
who had a lot of opportunities to live a good life and actually to make change. I mean, I try and talk a lot about that, I was born with a huge amount of confidence. Nothing ever, there was no challenges to my sense of what I could do ever.
Yeah.
And that's huge. When I opened up DC Central Kitchen in when I was trying to figure out how I would open in a way that would both, and it's very important, man, because this does talk about what I do. But I wanted to open the DC Central Kitchen in 1988, 89. But I was trying to find a way to not only benefit one organization, but use Washington, D.C., where I lived at the time, to open doorways. So, for example, I wanted to pick up food, and my business has been I take things our society thinks are part of the problem and try and reveal that the problem is oftentimes the way society views things, not the things in and of themselves, and that the things that we view as part of the problem can actually be part of a solution if you change your way of thinking. So I was saying, look, man, we throw away a ton of food every night. I can get that. But instead of just feeding the poor, which perpetuates a system, I could use that food to start a cooking school for men and women who were home from prison, off the streets.
Yeah.
We could feed more people better food for less money and produce beautiful, healthier meals by bringing all that food to a central kitchen where we could do the teaching. You could feed the city for free, and then entry-level people could get jobs, right? It was a good idea, but no one had ever done it before.
Hmm.
And I was looking around for a way to kick off the business and realized that George Bush Sr. was going to get inaugurated in like 2 months. So again, white dude's confidence, I'll just call up the Republican National Committee and they'll give me food because why wouldn't they, right? So that's what I did. And this was a good example, though, of both the benefits I inherited by birth, but also the way I tried to use that in kind of being an ally, for lack of a better word. Because what I was able to do in opening with George Food from the inauguration is oftentimes we encounter barriers or oftentimes urban myths. In this situation, there was this, and it's pernicious, dude, because you hear it still. Restaurants, hotels, people will say, oh, dude, I'd love to donate food, but it's illegal. And it's like, no, it's never been illegal. But that, I can say that till I'm blue in the face. But I was thinking, man, if I could get the president of the United States to donate food, not only will that benefit me, but then anybody else around the world, because again, from a media perspective, what media outlet is going to resist food from an inauguration going to poor people the next day? It's fucking news, you know? So, and pardon me, to those listening, that is the first of what will undoubtedly be many F-bombs that just kind of squirt out with love in my heart, you know? But anyway, but it was cool, man, because when I opened our door, but also people from around the country who saw it on TV could then say to anybody, the president of the United States just donated food. It can't be illegal, you know, kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So anyway, that's the way I've tried to live my life. How can I do things that this 49-51, 49% is my business, what I do, but 51% is how can I be of service to helping others open their doors via the way I do my business. So I don't know that that's how I introduce myself, but that at least, you know, I try to do my best with the question you asked.
No, that's really interesting. And I think there are a lot of different pieces to dissect that and things that I'm sure we'll get into. But one thing I want to take a step back to is just that, you know, you mentioned 1989, like starting this thing and you had the food at the inauguration being given to you. What were you doing before that? I'm sure a lot of people, because you were just around my age, or just you know, a little bit, you know, around there at the time. And so,
very much.
How did you get to that point? Was it just confidence that got you there? I'm sure there were other steps that you took before that to take that big leap.
Well, you know, there's an old thing when they oftentimes talk about, you know, the year you're born, the month you're born can have a huge influence on your trajectory, because it's when you enter school. Mm-hmm. You know, you can be a big kid for your age or a little kid for your age, depending on the month you're born. So, but I was born in 1958, which made me at 10 years old, at the age when your eyes really start to open to the world. I was 10 when Dr. King, Robert Kennedy were assassinated, you know, and that was, I mean, a gargantuan part of American history. It can't be understated, you know, how deep that wound was. Mm-hmm. But for a young kid growing up here in Los Angeles, it was also a time of Cesar Chavez doing 25-day fasts. It was a time of the beginning of the women's movement, not the beginning, but almost the televised world, you know. So, and I was a deeply curious kid who also loved music. And at the time, music was much more of a revolutionary force, you know. So as a kid, I became really kind of self-baptized in the sense of the adult I wanted to become, the world I wanted to be part of, the team I was playing for lack of a better word. It's not Republican, Democrat. It's just people who give a shit and people who don't, you know. And I wanted to be somebody who did. Right. So I always wanted to be engaged, but as a young man, I watched people hit walls constantly, right? And my attitude was, I got one life and I don't want to spend it beating my head against the wall. There's got to be metaphorical shortcuts that you can take, not out of laziness, but more out of cleverness, right? Mm-hmm. And as a kid, I became mesmerized by the power of entertainment, music, theater, comedy, art, dance. Yeah. So I ran nightclubs. And I didn't go to college, man. I barely graduated high school because I was sneaking out all the time to go to nightclubs because I was mesmerized by that craft, right? So as a young man, I went to work in nightclubs, and I worked there most of my late teens and 20s. And part of what I was trying to do was, again, reimagine the way a nightclub could look and sound and feel. And as the world was changing, the static barriers of things like a stage or even just the kind of routine. Like, dude, I don't know how often you go out to see shows, but I used to go out. I mean, I still go out a lot. But I'm surprised how much we do, even when we think we're so clever and classless and free, we still find ourselves marching in and kind of going through rote responses to entertainment. You know, the song is over, I do this now. the band is done, we do this until they come out and do one more encore. I just found it to be so predictable and boring. And it's like, I hate fucking routine, so it's like, there's got to be a way to mess with it to get more energy out of the experience, So anyway, I did that. But part of what I learned in my kind of collegiate approach to nightclubs was how much food we threw away. It was just part of the equation, for any food service. So after a night right down the street from George Washington University at Virginia Avenue and 20th Street, right across from the State Department, on a rainy night, I ended up serving poor people in Washington, D.C. as just kind of I won't say a lark, but an attempt to do something to address this issue of hunger and homelessness, which was growing. I mean, homeless people have always been around, but dude, I mean, what you grew up seeing in DC was revealed in the late 70s and early 80s when you started to really see people sleeping on the street. Laws changed and cops just couldn't roust people because they didn't belong there. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So like a lot of people, I went out one night to feed people and just was kind of both curious and, I say this, maybe too strong a word, but offended by this idea of well-intended, loving volunteers going out to serve the poor without doing anything else to help. I mean, it was as if that was enough.
Yeah.
So I just said, look, restaurants have tons of food they're throwing away, but they also have jobs. Why don't you start a cooking school? And dude, like any young man or young person, full of that sense of like, well, certainly the groups that are going out to serve people on the street will be excited by an idea that might really both reduce the cost of their program, but also in effect shorten the line of people waiting for food outside in the rain the night I went out. Maybe they'd be open to that. They weren't. Every group I went to say, hey, more people, better food, less money, shorten the line, restaurants get entry-level people, everybody wins. All the charities, dude, it was shocking, were so wedded to their system of serving people that way that they were ridiculously at times against change. And so I launched the DC Kitchen because no one else would, but at the same time, I launched it out of frustration that the groups that you think would have run to the idea that I was going to challenge them. But I was also, how do I, as an individual, how do I avoid becoming that?
Yeah. I
mean, dude, nobody wakes up when they're a young man your age and looks in the mirror and says, hey man, when I grow up, I'm going to be a boring bureaucrat that stifles innovation.
Right.
Yet the world's full of them. And so the question became, I think I mentioned earlier in that 1968, the kind of having a vision of the adult I wanted to grow into. Mm-hmm. How do I stay on that path? How do you avoid becoming the beast you set out to slay on your life's journey? Wow. So baked into all my businesses have been, how do I do things more efficient? How do I challenge the orthodoxy of charity, which, as I've said many times, is based on the redemption of the giver, not the liberation of the receiver? And how do I, at the same time, stay true to my path and not become a dick?
Yeah. No, it's interesting to think about, though, because you point at something that I think is so fascinating to me, especially in today's world where I feel like a lot is really out there. A lot of, organizations and how they're doing business is out there. In terms of the nonprofit space, for instance, especially, I think of international development. There are a lot of organizations who look, I'll say, organizations that do a lot of monitoring or evaluation, and then they look at these different nonprofits and say, they're giving them, they're giving them fish, but are they teaching them the fish? Are they making their lives better even by giving them the fish? Are their lives better because they're there? And so I just am fascinated that sort of thing still happens to this day. Hopefully it happens a lot less than it has in previous times, but I'm hoping that, the system's better. And one thing I want to learn from you is, what your view is on this system that we're dealing with. I definitely want to get back to, talking about why you're so interested in like you mentioned race and gender and, these different groups, but I'm curious, like just to stop at looking at the system, like how are you feeling about it going forward? Because you've already talked a little bit about,
Right.
you know, where it was in
Well,
the past.
this is one of my. I'm so digging this conversation, Matt, because this is really you're hard pressed to really look hard at philanthropy and not run into some intellectual realities that need to be confronted.
Mm-hmm.
So, philanthropy is based on, for the most part, old dead white dudes' money given away by other white dudes.
Uh-huh.
And even though we have obviously has seen a lot of women and people of color come into the nonprofit sector, even in leadership roles, sometimes they've inherited learned behavior of what is being a boss look like, and they inadvertently mimic what white dudes did. So we have to understand leadership differently, and that's one thing. But for the most part, the nonprofit sector was kind of for all intents and purposes, much more of a faith-based kind of movement until the mid-50s and 60s, where suddenly the sector exploded to do things like environmentalism and a lot of other different aspects of charity than just feeding the poor or taking care of, you know, orphans or, you know, the SPCA or, you know, the YMCA. And it became a much more complex sector. But what I find fascinating and I love to talk about is the sector, I believe, is a feminized part of the American economy. Right. That it is primarily run by women and primarily white women. So this was men in the 1960s and 50s, 60s, 70s, whatever, went off to work in corporate America. My mother's generation of women in the 1970s who either they wanted to professionally explore their lives or the economy shifted back then and we went from an economy where a single wage earner could fund a household, right? Suddenly you needed a two-wage earners. My mother was a generation of women who were stay-at-home moms, but in their late 30s, 40s decided they wanted to work. The dominant culture of the time, the male culture of business, said in effect, you don't have any skills that help us. You know, you've been a housewife or a mother. And this kind of ridiculous construct of you don't know business. And so your only jobs you're capable of is nurturing. You can be a teacher, a nurse, or do charity, right? Now, the sector back then was about 65,000 nonprofits. We went to 1.4 million organizations within about 25 years. And that happens to also coincide with when women went from about 20% of the workforce to 49%. So what you have is a sector A that is driven by white men's money that was given to white women primarily, not to challenge the authority of the white dudes who gave it, but to keep a lid on a simmering social issues. As long as we were feeding the poor leftover food from restaurants, hey man, you got grants. Yeah. But there's an old saying, when I fed the poor, they called me a saint. When I asked why they were poor, they called me a communist. And I think what you found was this wall that you hit, that white women or this sector hit when they tried to do economics or politics. So what you find in our sector, again, is this transition age where our entire model was built, as I suggested earlier, not on challenging the system that creates the problems, but just in effect doing benign charity that feeds the poor, clothes the naked, visits the prisoners, that kind of stuff. It was based, in effect, on, and I don't want to say white guilt, but I mean there was a sense of, you know, it was intended with love. It truly was. It was a great sense of almost faith-based. Every faith has this sense of our obligation to our fellow humans, but so often it's based on one-dimensional sense of you're hungry, I fed you, versus you're hungry, I fed you. Then we put our heads together to figure out how to keep you from being hungry and other people from being hungry. And that's normally where it either stops for many people or the money stops. To take this next big leap, which is something I've been very interested in, this means you have to start either earning your own money, which again is social enterprise, which gives you a little bit more, the ability to have a little bit more tenacity when it comes to your fight or your vocabulary. But I became equally interested, in fact, much of the work I've done, unsuccessfully I might add, is trying to say to the nonprofit sector, time out. You know, in 1848, there was the Seneca Falls Convention in which women and leaders of color, including Sojourner Truth and Frederick Douglass, got together to try and merge suffrage and abolition. Mm-hmm. And they began, for women at least, a 72-year march before the 19th Amendment, right? Giving women, white women, the right to vote. kind of, I hate to sound bad, but white women threw African-American women under the bus for the vote and said, we'll come back for you.
Yeah.
But here it was 50 years later, and they hadn't come back yet before African-Americans started to really push harder and harder. And it's very interesting because in 1954, with Brown versus the Board of Education, this was huge because from a historic perspective, this was a Supreme Court decision that challenged the separate but equal orthodoxy of what was known as Plessy versus Ferguson, which is a historic case, right? Now, the two people that brought this case were the NAACP, a nonprofit in Washington, D.C., led by Thurgood Marshall, and a minister in Topeka, Kansas. And so back then, you have to realize for African Americans to agitate for their political rights, the only place that African Americans could meet were churches. That was it. And they were nonprofits. So suddenly in 1954, Lyndon Johnson, who was then the Senate Majority Leader and the head of the Southern Dixiecrats, the Republican Party of the day, they were like, oh, fuck. Yeah. The first big crack in the dam is hit. So Lyndon Johnson, without hearing her testimony, introduced legislation that said nonprofit organizations cannot participate in politics. And that rule stopped. There were actually, up until then, there was no evidence of nonprofits actually doing anything illegal or unethical. And in fact, you could make a case that nonprofit political action had a lot to do with the birth of the labor movement. A lot of the advances made under FDR, Franklin Roosevelt's administration, things like Social Security, 40-hour work weeks, safety laws, things that started to rein in big business. Suddenly, boom, cut. And I've looked in that era and since, and nonprofits will tell you, oh, dudes, we can't be political. It's against the law. And I'm like, it's like, dudes, have you ever researched this? I mean, there's a couple of origin stories. And that thing I just went through, the whole idea that Johnson was trying to stop what was the inevitable, or at least slow down the inevitable moment in which African Americans at the time, even though the Great Migration North had happened, still for the South, this was a game changer, to get the vote. So I've said to a lot of nonprofits, we got to be political, and we should challenge the idea that we can't be political, because it goes back to this idea of women and the power they wield in our society. And I believe the nonprofit sector, which controls $3 trillion in assets, $300 billion in annual revenue, has 14 million employees, channels the energy of 70 million volunteers, and more importantly, you cannot make profit without nonprofits. Think about Washington, D.C., a town where you live and where I live.
Yeah.
But without universities, hospitals, education, healthcare, communities of faith, arts and culture, clean air, clean water, all the things that nonprofits do, you can't make money in a town. There's no commerce in a town without what we do. Yet we've been told all that we're eligible for is leftover money that is designed more often to make the donor look better, the corporate donor, whatever, look better, not make us more effective, and no politics. And so I believe there's an inevitable moment, and I'm there a little bit earlier than many because I'm a white dude in America who ran a successful nonprofit who had the rarest of rare things, the ability to look up from day-to-day action and actually raise my head above the sector and see, it's like, wow, there are some of the big roadblocks that are keeping us in this kind of charity box. Maybe if we could undo those. And that's kind of where, I'm sorry I'm being long-winded here, but that's the journey I've been on. It's like, wow, our lack of political power and the fact that we have to solicit and rattle a cup for leftover money that we help make to run our organizations. This is why we've been unable to escape the loving trap that is charity versus the kind of more respectful fight for equal and just liberated world.
That's such an interesting, you kind of set it up in a way that I feel like I could wrap my head, and probably a lot of people who are watching or listening could wrap their heads around. And it's just interesting to me to think about I don't want to say the toxic dynamic necessarily, but the dynamic that exists where, we have all these people and nonprofits, but I'll think of them as people, really, people who are working to make change in one way or another, whether that's with hunger and food and nutrition, or, you know, a homelessness, or whatever the case might be. And it's such a tough fight to do that for a number of reasons, often because, like you were saying, for example, as an organization that might want to support a nonprofit, it's about what am I getting out of it?
Right.
And I mean, I would say that that's probably human nature in part, but in large part, but also that's something that, you know, I feel like our organizations need to try to rise above. But it makes me think of your work because, I mean, I'm thinking of just examples that I've seen, which is like feeding people who are, you know, whose homes are burning down in wildfires, something that's like very, you know, very
Right.
very relevant right now, of course. And then you look at like some of the work that Jose Andres is, a lot of the work that he's done, and you look at Puerto Rico, for example, highly publicized, for instance, and it's like that work is necessary, but you know, but oftentimes we need funds to fund and support that work, and it's not always
Well,
there.
let's focus on that.
Yeah.
And before we get there, I want to touch on the one thing about toxic you mentioned, because
Please.
I mentioned earlier in our conversation about this urban myth about donating food. And the only two rules as far as donating food, and it frankly just describes the charitable world oftentimes. It either has to be, the only way you can be found guilty of hurting someone if you try and feed the poor with leftover food,
Yeah.
is if it's malicious intent or gross negligence.
Mm-hmm.
And so toxic is gross negligence. I mean, it's malicious intent. In other words, I know what I'm doing. Most charity is that kind of gross negligence. It's just I almost didn't know better. It was an accident, a well-intended accident.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to escape that orbit of how do you purposely set out. But Jose's work, and I'm on the board of the World Central Kitchen. We do a lot of things together, Jose and I. But a lot of what we've been doing over the years is saying what's already there and how can we use it different. So, for example, the historic construct of feeding, and even though Puerto Rico is the United States, we still almost apply, we don't even apply the same standard we do to Georgia or any place else as we do with Puerto Rico. But the point is, the model of charity is oftentimes we fly in food and distribute it. What we've been trying to say with World Central Kitchen, and Jose has so brilliantly put into action, is wait, time out. We're trying to rebuild the economy. The way we by bringing food in, you actually retard the local economy at a time when they need economic opportunities. So instead, why don't we come in and buy local food and hire local people to run these things? So in effect, let's find the restaurateurs who are out of work, who have kitchens, buy food from the local community. That way we're supporting the economy and we're keeping people employed while we create the meals that are necessary during a time of emergency. But it's a radically different construct. And what Jose ran into when he first started doing this in Puerto Rico in particular was the federal government, the Red Cross, all these groups were like, hey, who invited you? Yeah. We're the pros, you're just a chef.
Yeah.
And again, think about it I mean, Jose's been saying, who better to feed people than chefs? But other groups who had become professionalized the idea of emergency response were like, oh, no, we have a system and your model doesn't fit, as opposed to saying, wait, maybe that's a better idea. Maybe we should reimagine everything we've been doing, even though maybe we've been doing it for 40 or 50 years. And this is what's interesting, Matt, is, again, how do people become people who stand in the way of new ideas when in theory, and this has been the kind of the benchmark of my career. To a certain extent, I sure can't pick them. I go up against some really big, audacious issues with new ideas. So whether it's homelessness, school food, senior meals, you go in assuming, and this is probably the plight of many of the people who are listening today, is you go in kind of assuming, wow, this is more efficient, it's more effective, it's more economically just, it liberates people. Who's not going to like it? And oftentimes, it's the people who should be your best friends. It's the people who should be like, whoa, dude, what a great new idea. This changes everything about the way I think and act. Let's do it together. What you find, it can be really maddening, is people are like, oh no, dude, this changes my world and I'm not going to accept it. And you're like, you look at people sometimes and it's like, I thought we'd be friends. I thought we'd be allies. I thought you'd respect and appreciate faster, better, cheaper, powerful. But dude, that's, this is probably the biggest burden or hurdle for anybody, young or old, is how do you get over this understandable anger that can actually derail your sensibilities when you encounter unnecessary roadblocks. I mean, years ago, if you can see it, I got this little heart on my finger. So when I do this, it's like, put it away, put it away. Sometimes the people who are saying no are just afraid. And this is if I can save a lot of your friends or anybody some unnecessary anguish, it's realizing that people usually aren't evil or stupid or dumb. They're just afraid. This represents new thinking. And just because it's better, smarter, faster, doesn't make it an easier pill for the sick person to swallow. So once you realize that you're going to change is going to understandably elicit a fearful response that you might interpret as they don't like me, or they think my idea is stupid, or they're so stupid. It's like, it's none of the above. It's a little bit of each. But the point is, if you realize, and I've said this many times, I'm not in the nonprofit business. I'm in the bravery business.
Yeah.
My job is to help people embrace their natural courage, whether it's an addict, whether it's somebody who's homeless, whether it's a volunteer, whether it's a politician, whether it's a banker. Most people have behaviors that are based on a comfort. How do I find comfort and find a safe corner of the world in which I can live, versus the unknown of trying new things or embracing new ideas. And most people would rather, it sounds good to like change, but the reality is, as there's an old saying, everybody wants to move the graveyard, but you won't get a lot of help from people on the inside. And so that's the story of change, man. Most people love the idea, but that doesn't mean they're super red hot to change their world to do it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I feel like you've been in this space doing a lot of work that's gotten many stakeholders on board. So I'm wondering, what advice do you have to, if any, to effectively get people on board with, your idea or concept, even if it's you have the blueprint and everything and they still won't budge? Like what is it that you've seen is other than fear and, what you just discussed as a barrier, what is it that you've seen as that barrier? And then how do you overcome that?
In a word, my handsome young brother, policy. Now it's funny. I came to LA, and just for those of your listeners who don't know, 6 years ago, I started the LA Kitchen. And 3 weeks ago, I had to close. And I ran into what I thought would be a slam dunk, that I'm the one who got slammed. And it boiled down to this. I came to LA because the future in my business, and I tend to be an amateur futurist, what's around the bend, and rather than wait to get hit by the car, how do I not only get out of the way, but help others out of the way at the same time, or maybe even get the car to stop, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And I became fascinated on the issue of food waste, and all wasted food banks, pantries, every bit of that inventory represents lost profit. Somebody bought it, grew it, manufactured it, couldn't sell it, they gave it to charity. That ain't gonna last. So it's like, wow, there's gonna be less and less food to feed people. And there's an estimated 45 million people who are at risk of hunger. And here come the baby boomers, right? And every single morning in America, 10,000 people turn 70. And what you're gonna see coming is a frightening level, frightening level of older people who are gonna live longer than they have money in the bank. So I became fixated on this issue of, we gotta get out in front and really examine, talk about, and explore this issue of senior poverty, as well as how do we feed that many seniors. Now, again, I just want to really just stop for a second, because that's not exclusively what I do. Because there's an element of, why do we treat seniors this way? And there's other elements that I want to focus on, but business 101, I wanted to set up a kitchen. And I came out here because LA has this giant contract, the city, to do senior meals, right? So it's like, boom, I'm going to get that contract.
Yeah.
Not only that, but they have a unanimously passed by the city council in 2012 an ordinance called the Good Food Purchasing Act, which says any city agency spending more than 10 grand a year on food has to buy local and, check a bunch of boxes. Yeah. And I'm like, dudes, that's what I do. This is going to be easy. Not only can I help LA be part of a revolution in feeding seniors, but I can actually help the Department of Aging quickly get in compliance with something they're mandated to do. Mm-hmm. I did not anticipate a determined obstinance of the Department of Aging in this town, right? And after I just lost a ton of money trying to kind of earn my way in, saying, maybe you don't understand. What I'm here to do is, instead of getting processed meals for a low wage and seeing your profit leave LA and never come back, I'm here to buy local food, keep people out of jail, produce beautiful, healthy meals, and reinvest any profit I make in the nonprofit side of the business. We'll put out even more meals for free. You'll get 2-for-1 meals. So it's kind of shocking, right? But what I discovered a little bit too late, and what I've worked on since, is how do you create contract reform so that in effect it is legally impossible for a Department of Aging or any other group to run interference for a big multinational caterer? How do you create, in effect, reform in which rebates, which is, I won't go into that now, but it's a big part of what fuels corporate influence over food in America, is payoffs, for lack of a better word. How do you, and I've been working with the city's procurement reform office, a brand new office here in LA, to institute this kind of language so what happened to LA Kitchen won't happen to others. But this is a lot of what I tell people is, look, sometimes you need to help people over the hurdle. Sometimes you can attract their interest economically, which I like to do. Sometimes you can attract their interest by social impact, which I do both, economic impact, social impact. But sometimes they need a little extra hand. And this is where it's always important to, and I go back to my earlier talk about the Johnson Amendment. Oftentimes the nonprofit sector thinks, well, we've elected a new mayor. Let's take turns going in there and talking about our specific issue, homeless, housing, arts, whatever. My attitude is, why don't we use our nascent political power to elect somebody who shows up on day one, completely understands the role that nonprofits are essential to profit, understands that social enterprise is powerful because we keep the money local, which if I'm a mayor of any town in America, that's going to ring my bell. How do we start to elect people who think that way versus think it's our job to educate dumbos once they're elected? So, that's kind of a long soliloquy, but it explains how my journey from, I want to help change, I've had to overcome barriers to change, but ultimately I realized that the most powerful potential barrier is to channel the energy of my peers, volunteers, and the people who are served to vote for people who will fundamentally make change that will decrease the need for charity in the first place.
Right. And even then, I think one thing that, and it would be interesting to hear your thoughts on this, at least briefly, but one thing is, I was just in LA in August for the Climate Reality Project. It's founded by Al Gore. They hosted their Climate Reality Leadership Training or Leadership Core Training. And at that training, it was their biggest one yet, with 2,000 plus climate reality leaders. And we're all there for 2.5 days, learning more about climate change. We're talking about, things within California. So the wildfires and other, other things that affect California specifically, but then also globally, just the effects of climate change and how that's accelerating, which, as a side note, is another reason why a lot of the work that nonprofits are doing is so important. But, there's so much energy within that. And then even still, it takes more than just having all of that energy and that focus on social impact. I went to GW's business school, and I always think to myself, if you give me an argument for why someone's doing something and it ties back to their bottom line, usually I could say, I could see how that could work, because there is always going to be an economic motivation for,
right.
Whether it's governments or multinational corporations or whoever it might be. So I think that's interesting that you broke that down, and I appreciate that. And I want to get back to what I mentioned at the beginning, or what you mentioned, which is your focus on, I would say, really 3 groups in a way. So you mentioned women, but you even said, you were talking about people of color, people of, different backgrounds that are typically not as well represented in this space, and then also young people. So what's your passion where does that passion come from to direct your energy toward those groups, or people like me, basically, is what I would say.
Well, again, I go back to that summer of 1968, because again, I was an intensely curious kid.
Yeah.
So I, at a very early age, read, and I don't want to sound like the white dude, but I mean, I just really wanted to know.
Yeah.
So I read books, I met people, I talked to people. Like, I lived in DC as a young kid, and I walked DC. I mean, I walked every inch of that town, and I'm not talking about Northwest. That's over the whole town. And wherever I travel, I walk and listen, and I try and understand. And to be quite honest with you, I've spent a lot of time trying to unlearn a lot of what I was taught, both in school, but also intrinsically as a white dude. So it's been an incredibly purposeful journey. But man, again, I've tried to explain this to people. I was raised in a faith tradition that said, here's the way you behave as a person of character, person of faith. I was raised in a country that talked about civics, and your responsibility as a citizen. And I also, for a very short period of time, was a Boy Scout, and the idea of leaving your campsite better. So to a certain extent, and maybe I say this a different way. I was introduced the other day, and somebody said, dude, Robert Egger's a visionary. And it's like, dude, when you're born a white dude in America, you're born with vision, and it's just how you use it. I mean, when you're born this high up, if you're not a visionary, something's fucking wrong with you. But the question is, how do you use that vision? And like I said, my thing is always, I was just deeply into equality and deeply into justice. And now, again, it doesn't mean, and I think it's one thing to say I'm interested in justice. Everybody, it's easy to say. How do you actually do it, and live it? And again, man, I always say I'm a recovering hypocrite because, I still, there's things I do. It's not as if I am, like, I've got a friend named Art in DC, and Art's a Catholic worker. I don't know if you know the Dorothy Day Catholic workers. But Art is one of these guys, he's probably been arrested, I mean, honestly, probably 150, 200 times. Mm-hmm. And he's down at the Pentagon praying every Friday, does a prayer thing at the Pentagon. And Art is so much more of a true believer, activist than I'll ever be, and I've been, I've been on Oprah, I've been on television shows, I've gotten every kind of award or accolade you can. Nobody's ever going to know Art. He's just a guy who's out there. But I look at him, it's like, I wish I could be more like him. I mean, he's so deeply real, but anyway, man, like I said, it's just, plus I just like the people I meet in this arena, the people that I've had the joy of working with, ever since. Again, it isn't as if everybody in the world isn't a little bit freaked out right now, but I've been talking to a lot of young people ever since I announced both that I was leaving or leaving LA and that the LA Kitchen was stopping. And I announced last week at Independent Sectors Gathering, I was a keynote speaker, which actually was kind of interesting because I gave them an hour. I said, dudes, I can understand if you don't want somebody's business just closed to be one of your keynote speakers. And they're like, oh no, dude, we want, no one ever talks about failure in our sector, Yeah. But anyway, I use this to talk about how the fact that I was very inspired by Colin Kaepernick and his idea of taking a knee. And I said, you know what? I'm going to take a knee, not in a symbolic gesture, but in that sense of look, your generation has a big, hairy, audacious world ahead of you. And my attitude about me and my generation is that our great destiny is to have the humility to get down on our knee and say, we had our shot. It's your generation's turn. How can either I, A, be of service to you, or B, how can my shoulders climb up on my shoulders, stand taller, and anything I can do in service of you will be, is what I might, and I'll do it, open source. But I announced that my new address was regger@fuckingshitup.net, and the audience laughed, and I'm like, and I leaned in, it's like, I'm not kidding, and that's kind of my construct. But I challenged him and said, look, A, I know people kind of laugh, at the kind of audacious nature of naming a business fucking shit up. But our country was built by people who wanted to fuck shit up. When you think about it, Harvey Milk wanted to fuck shit up. Sojourner Truth wanted to fuck shit up. I mean, even when you think about the framers of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, when in the course of human events it becomes whatever, that's just a fancy ass way of saying, dude, let's fuck shit up. So to me, fucking shit up is American, and it's based with love and not anger and not bitterness and not like, let's fuck it up, like burn it down, as much as with love and audacious energy and spirit and frankly, again, channeling the energy, not of just those people, but, going back to the climate change. Yeah. Look at in 1 week, the difference the 100 women have made who just came into Congress. Look at how quickly they are pushing, the powers that be in Washington, D.C. to actually do something about climate change. I'm reminded of the two young women. I mean, Bernie Sanders, everybody loves Bernie, but the reality is it was two young women, Black Lives Matter activists, who took the stage and took the mic in Seattle, Washington, and didn't give it back, and kind of helped Bernie embrace the idea of Black Lives Matter. I mean, he had to really be pushed into that corner by young people. So there's a part of me that just, I'm really kind of, I'm excited about what your generation brings. Although, as I like to say, you all are already in charge, man. There's 100 million of you all. No. I mean, people under 30. And this election, there was like 16 million new voters. It's almost like, dudes, and I know it's not homogenous, dude, but there's an attitude of like, why occupy the street? Take over the town. So I'd love to see more people your age, like the young mayor of Fresno, the young mayor of Baton Rouge, young people running for office who are just saying, hey man, universal basic income, let's give it a shot,
Yeah, I have to ask as a follow-up to that, what are ways, because I've like met so many people who are like pushing and like, I mean, with love, but like almost violently, aggressively fighting for what they believe in. And yet there is this system and this establishment, and like you were saying, like older white dudes that are often not either not giving them opportunities or pushing back. And then even I see a lot of things where it's like, a lot of the time looking at conferences, looking at different media networks, whether that's news or podcasts, whatever it might be. And it's like, oh, there are a lot of like white guys in there. Or, if it's they're pushed for diversity, or their version of that is like, okay, we're going to have lots of older white guys and we're going to have some younger ones. And then we're going to have women. We're going to have a lot of women, but white women. And so what are ways that just some of the ways that you think, I'll say people of your generation, as you described it, or like the older white dudes, or the others I described in that dominant group, could help those people or assist those people who are fighting and hitting that barrier. I'm really wondering if you have advice for those people who are in the positions of power.
Well, this was part of the speech I just did. Was I said, look, I'm taking a knee, but I'm looking around the room and I'm seeing a lot of men my age. But more importantly, I'm seeing a lot of organizations that are 50 years old and 60 years old. Yeah. And so how do those organizations say, in effect, because think about it, many of these groups are like, we've been around for a long time. So when they look at the Women's March, Black Lives Matter, or a variety of other very successful youth-led organizations, they don't say, how can we serve you? We've had 50 years to fight hunger, equality, and we've done great work, but we haven't busted through. So in all humility, we not submit, but we offer our metaphorical shoulder in solidarity, but we want to ask you, what can we do for you? Not how can you serve us? And that to me, now again, this is where I think my journey becomes a little bit more rosy glasses on kind of stuff. Because, dude, one of the things I wanted to do with seniors when I came here is, look, it's not like, I heart seniors. It's just, dude, that's my business. That's who's next to be radically, sadly poor in America. But I got to figure, man, again, I'm a romantic, but I got to figure every morning, a whole bunch of those baby boomers wake up and say, look in the mirror and say, how the fuck? It's like, dude, I'm 60 now. It's like, how did I get to be 60? Mm. But for many of those people, they got to be wondering, man, how did I get so tricked into thinking if I just bought more stuff, I'd be happy? And sure, I got a lot of shit, but there's just something missing. And what I see every day, man, is them pouring out of their homes into the nonprofit sector, saying, clumsily, I might add, but they're saying, use me. I have so much to give, and I want to make a difference. I want to feel like my life mattered. Dude, that's power. And for the nonprofit sector to understand that instead of saying, well, come in and help us chop vegetables, or come in and help us paint the wall, or come and help tutor inner city kids. How do we say, cool, and we're going to put you to work, but let's talk about voting. Let's talk about the way you spend your money every day. See, I'm interested in market forces and how, we could spend the next 10,000 years giving charity, money at the end of the year, extra money, versus how quickly could we change shit if we actually channeled the purchasing power of 70 million volunteers. For example, an idea I put forward a while ago, that of course met with crickets from the sector, but was, hey, what would it be like if the nonprofit sector got together and created a seal of approval for business? And we said to our 70 million volunteers, hey man, thanks for coming down, but can we ask you a favor? Fundamentally, we need to reduce the need for charity. If you spend your money, look for our symbol, the United Charities of America. Look for our symbol on businesses, because every time you shop in that store, because of their wage, their benefits policy, they give people the day off to vote, child care, a bunch of different metrics. But every time you spend your money there, you diminish the need for charity here. Imagine that. We can do that tomorrow, literally. And imagine this is what, when you study, whether it's Indian independence, whether it's the civil rights movement, whether it's the farm workers movement, all three relied and were built around the idea of the boycott. The salt boycott in India, the bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama, and the great boycott here in Delano, California. All three said to poor people, if you don't buy salt from the British, if you don't ride the bus, if you don't buy table grapes, three very inexpensive things. Salts, it only took a dime to ride a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. And table grapes, the idea that you could confront the British Empire, race, or landowners with grapes, dimes, and salt seems preposterous. It worked. And what Dr. King, what Mahatma Gandhi, what Cesar Chavez, and Larry Itlong did in each of those cases was say to poor people, the way we spend our money is a difference between bondage and freedom. So in my opinion, they were social entrepreneurs because they talked about how you spend your money. I just believe in what I like to call the boycott versus the boycott. How do you incentivize and reward behavior versus punish? And so for us to realize that we can actually potentially say to our volunteers, the way you spend your money every day can actually decrease the need for charity. And you can still get goods and services a la capitalism, but you can get social impact at the same time. This is the great promise of social enterprise that I think should have been our pursuit over the last 20 years. We who self-identify as social entrepreneurs. Sadly, many of us have been tricked into the folly of scale, and we spend all our time trying to build individual cathedrals to our brilliance versus spread the liberating faith of social enterprise to the masses and just suggest we are but one example of the power of everyday commerce.
Yeah. And I think that's
a lot of heavy shit, man.
No, it is. And I think it's powerful, but it's something for people to think about.
It's doable, dude. That's my thing. It's like, many people you meet have crazy ass ideas, but it's like, yeah, dude, whatever. But all I'm saying is, it's been proven. If you look at any great liberation movement, ultimately what's revealed is that if poor people or people who are marginalized don't participate, suddenly their power is revealed. So what I'm saying is Gandhi, King, and Chavez revealed the power of everyday commerce. And to a certain extent, he's not popular, but as a young man, I became and went to hear Minister Farrakhan speak a couple of times because I was just very interested in the idea of what was the nation talking about when it came to economic owning your own money within the African-American community. And there were many things that I felt eye-opening around commerce within the African-American community that was really untapped. How do we own our own money and control our own communities versus spending our money and having it leave our community and never impact us? And that's a very, legit question. So I just do the same thing on a larger scale, but I think it still applies to the same thing is are you kind of benignly participating in life, which many people do, or are you fundamentally thinking, wait a second, I've got real opportunities here, the way I vote, the way I choose to live, the friend, spouse, lover, husband I am, or the consumer I am. And I've just tried to live my life purposely executing on every aspect of my being. How can I be a better person? And along the way, help as many people out as I can.
I'm glad you said that. And I'm glad that I just want to stop or slow down for a second to even just say that That's one thing. That's one reason I wanted to speak with you, because I could even see in just everything you have out there, and how, how you use your breath anytime you're given a chance to do it. Apparently, that you're always pointing to the fact that we need to be considering these bigger issues beyond ourselves, beyond our own identities, and for me, it's when it comes to just that representation, it's so important, like within what I'm doing with 180 Degrees of Impact, to talk with people from a bunch of different backgrounds to understand what they're doing and why they do what they do, and like what makes them tick. And it's interesting for me to talk with you because you're from that perspective of like, hey, like if you look at me on the surface, like maybe I'm not the guy that would care about all these things that I'm bringing to light, but yet I feel like every other sentence you're shining a light on that. And there might be people out there, I'm sure there are, who will listen, who have listened to things you've said and said, no, that's wrong, I don't like how you're doing that. But I think the thing that no one could disagree about is the fact that you're continuing the conversation, right, and you're shining a light on that. And in some circles where they're not having that conversation, you're starting it.
Well, thank you, man. I appreciate that. And that's a lot of what I'm trying to do, is to go back to, tactic, is I must admit, I think that I can't just write off my generation, and neither can you. I mean, for example, one of the most, I must admit, I try to be a nice person, but sometimes I can get really frustrated because, for example, in my business over the last 6 years, one of the issues, I knew what I was doing, but I felt like I could bring a lot of energy to the task of getting people to see not just the issue of poverty, but this idea of, as I like to say, my business was taking food that would have been wasted, and people are society undervalues, and showing the power. So we used to say, wrinkled food, wrinkled people, no waste, right? Yeah. And I would hear people, foundation people, smart people say, oh, dude, I love what you do, Robert, but we just don't do seniors. I mean, kids are the future. And I'd be like, take a deep breath and say, in effect, that sounds, I get it, but that's actually, redonkulous. I mean, the reality is the economics of my generation's healthcare costs will bankrupt your generation if we don't find a way out of this. And we cannot afford intergenerational warfare, which is what is happening now, because my generation and those older are the most reliable voters in America. Yeah. And you can see how they've been manipulated by fear. I mean, they've been manipulated, sadly, on purpose to vote against their own best interests or the interests of their grandchildren. But they must be redeemed. I believe there is a redemption potential in my generation. And a lot of that, like any ignorance, is cured by proximity to the things that you are afraid of. And you realize, oh, wow, I don't have to be afraid. So I became really interested in this idea of how can you help people who are afraid and are feeling marginalized? How do you get them to feel welcome again? So I became very interested in, for example, an intergenerational political alliance. And interesting enough, food and food policy, which is environmentalism, it's weight, it's nutrition access, it's even things as benign as labels on products, so you understand what you're consuming. These are multi-generational. You can get old and young to potentially come to the table around environmental or these kind of issues. Let's use food not just to feed the poor, but to purposely set out to create the first step on aligning generations politically. Because the only way I believe we're going to be able to, something as simple as take back the food system, let alone dislodge the corporate interests that now control our elected leaders, is through an intergenerational alliance. It's the only way. So I have to work towards that idea of both getting my generation to understand the way they were the richest, freest, most educated generation ever, and had one of the best soundtracks in the history of the world. How do you not find your way back to the 60s, but how do you re-explore the way you felt when you were young? And that sense of, I'm going to change the world. I'm going to be part of something bigger. I want to help. I think that energy is still within many boomers. And I think that if a younger generation opens up and says, we want to work with you, but we don't work for you. And with all respect, baby boomers, your time is past. And it's our time now. Help us on our journey. This is the great, both the bravery it takes for a generation to again, not submit, but at least acknowledge, and the patience it's going to take a younger generation to help a generation get down on that creaky old knee so they can climb up on their shoulders. That's going to take a lot more maturity than many of our movements are expressing right now. And I think that's something that interests me right now, is how do we align ourselves, and how do we accept each generation for both its strengths and its weaknesses, but find that common ground in which we serve one another.
That's a deep conversation, and definitely a conversation I want to have with you at some point. But I will say this: we've been talking for an hour. People are going to love just hearing your insight and hearing this conversation. But one thing I want to ask you about, kind of as we wrap up this recording, is just that you mentioned your career and your life so far, and I'm wondering if you had to sum it up, either at this point or better yet, looking ahead to what you want to accomplish, what would the title of your book or documentary be? Like, if you had a documentary just about your life, to sum it all up.
Fucking shit up with love and purpose.
What? I didn't realize you'd have add on the love and purpose, but it's good stuff. It's good, and I think it's clear that you really embody that idea, and I'm really glad that you're speaking up and doing it in a way that's, hey, just putting yourself out there. You have a lot of equity and wisdom and connections and everything you've built up over the last however many years, and so it's I'm glad that you're using that in a way that's beneficial to other people, including myself, selfishly, I guess, So do you have I'm curious, do you have any other final words other than just directing people to different links online where they should connect with you and check you out?
No, man, but I mean, I just say that the world we seek isn't as far away as it might seem. But one of my favorite lines in the movies was always the last line of The Wizard of Oz. Next time I go looking for my heart's content, I won't look any further in my own backyard. Be a better human, be a decent human as best you can. Do random acts of kindness, but do it in your own backyard. And then, again, man, it's that small ripple. Every time you do something decent and kind and good, I guarantee you, man, whether it's karma, whatever you want to call it, it actually works. Take this old dude's counsel. That shit adds up, and you might not know it, but dude, when I announced I was closing LA Kitchen and I pushed that button on send, I was almost nauseous because I thought people are going to say I fucked up. People are going to think I'm a failure. Dude, it's almost embarrassing. It's like I'm one of the luckiest people in the world because I literally had a funeral while I'm still alive. People said the nicest fucking things. I was overwhelmed. Overwhelmed by the amount of people who said, you made a difference in my life. I was so unprepared for it. But dude, that was just going to work every day. I went to work 25 fucking years in the basement of the biggest shelter in America, down at 2nd and D. And the idea that would add up, all those little actions that I never even thought much about, they were just attempts, vainglorious attempts at trying to be a better person every day. Yeah. But that it added up to that much love. I was really unprepared. So I would tell your viewers, do not underestimate what is achieved by just a relentless incrementalism. That idea of relentlessly pursuing, how can I be a better person? How can I participate in making the world a better place every day? It adds up. I'm overwhelmed by it.
Yeah. I have to ask, actually, one question I didn't ask earlier, but just I want to give you the opportunity to do it. Who are some of the people that you would like to thank for being part of that journey? I mean, you had so many people thanking you for all the work that you did, but is there anyone who you would really like to credit or thank for just all that you've accomplished and all that you are, even more importantly, today?
Well, you know what, dude? I've worked all my life with men and women out of prison who are addicts, and I love. Sounds funny, man, but I love people who are in recovery because they're super honest, and they've always kept me really honest. Yeah. And it isn't people who say nice things to me; it's people who tell me when I'm fucking up that I really appreciate the most. And I've always loved working with people who've come out of recovery because they're the first people who say, "That's fucked up." You might be my boss, but that's still fucked up, and I've really appreciated. So having people around me who were the kind of friend who really helps you be the person you want to be versus help you pretend you're the person you want to be.
Yeah.
You know, to me, they're the people I've respected the most. But I'd be remiss if I didn't acknowledge my friend Jose Andres, man. You know, he is a guy who throughout his career, for those of you who don't know, I mean, Jose is a famous chef. And when I met him, he was a young dude. I mean, we're probably, I think, 10 years apart, but we've known each other for like 28 years now. But he has never, ever missed an opportunity to say, when people talked about his work, he's like, oh, you must meet my friend Robert Egger. I mean, again, his entire career has been trying to help the DC kitchen or the LA kitchen or now World Kitchen shine a light. And he's the kind of person I've amazed because he never doesn't do that. And I mean, you know, most people, they can get really overwhelmed by the adulation. And Jose he's the beneficiary of a lot of adulation. But I swear to God, he's one of the most pure humans I've ever met. And he's been a great friend. And it's funny, man, the student that becomes the master after a while, you know, but he's been a decent friend and I owe a lot to him.
Yeah. And, you know, I think I was saying this to you before, but just to give added credit to him, I took the World on a Plate course, which is where I was first introduced to your work and DC Central Kitchen. And that was just after LA Kitchen was founded and everything. So all this stuff was coming together. But the most impressive thing to me is that taking that course, which Jose taught, like I was sitting there and I was just mesmerized at the fact that here's someone who's making such a massive impact in the world. And I was just discovering it at the time. Now I'm even more in awe of it, but like I could be in this room and it's like, I don't know what to do. He's staring me right in the eyes. He's 10 feet away. And like, he's talking about the power to change the world. And I think that speaks to the fact that it's so important to remind people that they have that power. And so I have to thank you again for that over the course of this time. But I know people have a lot more to learn from you. So where could they learn more? Where could they keep up with you and all that you're doing, Robert?
Well, it's funny, man. I've always had websites and I'm not sure what I'm going to do now. But from now on, I'm just, you know, R. Egger, Robert, you know, R. Egger at fuckingshitup.net. Yeah. All one word, you know. But, you know, we'll see what it goes. I mean, if anybody wants to be Facebook friends or Instagram, I use Instagram. I think it's a powerful medium. But I'm not sure how I'm going to communicate in the future. To be determined. But, you know, again, man, I'm like a bad rumor. I never go away.
Yeah. Well, then people will keep up. They'll find you somehow.
Yeah.
And if people want to keep up with 180 Degrees of Impact, it's www.lets.care. hello@lets.care is the email address. And there are links to everything. If you're watching on video, there's the 180 Degrees of Impact podcast. I hope you check it out. It's Let's, actually the official name is LET' care. Let's Care, the 180 Degrees of Impact podcast. It's all out there. You have to be on all of the platforms nowadays. And like you're saying, I don't know how I'm going to communicate with people in the future either, because who knows where all the platforms are going to go. Facebook and, you know, I don't even know where MySpace is anymore. And that was a thing. So but it was good talking with you.
Yeah,
we'll keep up somehow. And as I say at the end of each and every one of these interviews, first and foremost, thanks again for all of the time that you're giving and all the presence that you're giving. But also to you and to anyone else who's watching or listening, keep impacting. Thanks again.
Right on.
Yeah.